the market has gone through a correction, right? So we have seen a lot of private raise gone through a down run, right? Cooling down the market. But I think with some of the recent IPOs, we have starting to see a surge, both in APAC and the US, right? In Q1 of 2017 this year, in China, I think the Shenzhen Stock Exchange alone has the 73 IPOs. Shanghai Stock Exchange 70, right? The New York Stock Exchange about 15 plus NASDAQ line. So you see that is coming back, right? There's a opportunity, but in the private and VC environment, I think there's a lag behind because the opportunity I think is still good for growth investment. So because we started early last year to position for low and Gopher, so we see a lot of a very interesting opportunity starting to emerge, and it's good timing to get into the probably some of the later growth and mezzanine round. That kind of there's a upcoming opportunity, the next wave of the IPOs. That's what we are saying. Of course, this is very tied up with the fundamental of the company itself, right? So we have Gopher, we back some of the leading company in China, including today's headline, 今日头条. We also recently invested in Next EV, 未来汽车, some of the leading companies, like Datong Dianping, which is a Yelp of China, and Zhongtong, we had the IPO last year. So there's some interesting wave that some of the very fundamentally very strong company are coming out to the market as well. Yeah.
And Alexander, you obviously have a great window on Indonesia, and see some of and there's been a bunch of companies that have become well-noted global high flyers. Gojek is of course well-known, and Tokopedia and others that are based out of Singapore but active, Carousel and others. How do you view the environment in Indonesia? How is that evolving, and is it frothy like the rest of the world? Is it correcting?
So let me start with us as a telco, right? As a telco, we are the typical later stage investment that people we issue bonds on a regular basis, and we attract a certain kind of investor who looks for fixed income. Every time I meet them on our non-deal roadshows, the most that they ask is, when are you going to spin off your towers? That's the only thing they ask. But we believe we have a lot of assets that I mentioned before, that the contact points, the outlets that we have 250,000, the big customer base. We need to find ways to monetize this. Some of the companies that you mentioned, there's only a handful there's only 2 or 3 unicorns in Indonesia today, right? And they're only addressing very specific markets. Fortunately or unfortunately, all of the big funds are very focused in those, because there's no other opportunity. We have a fund together with SoftBank, $50 million fund, that we try to spend, for theoretically $5 million per investment. It was very tough to find for a $5 million investment. So, a lot of later stages, but there's some very big ones already, but in between there's nothing, right? So that's why, like I said before, China 10 years ago, a lot of opportunity, and that's where we are today.
How is the valuation environment in Indonesia, both at the kind of earlier stage or mid-stage?
I think now they're getting realistic. I mean, when Gojek started to come to play, when the big players start to come in, the expectation become unrealistic. But I think it's got, together with the global trend, it's getting to a point where everything makes sense.
And Chuck, I'd be interested to hear your perspective, maybe specifically on the question of how these deals are structured, because that's obviously has a lot of impact on returns. And I know as you had these crossover guys come in and other strategics, I mean, it resulted in some unusual developments that move away from some of the historical norms, perhaps. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that.
Right. From a deal execution standpoint, I think what we're seeing is sort of a reinforcement of some of the prior trends that were in place starting really in 2015 when there were a lot of corrections to some of the valuations. And so I think there are 3 kinds of late stage financings. One is the company's doing great, no one's conversion price is being affected, and it's pouring more gasoline into a high performing race car and just running to the liquidity event. The second is where the company's still viable, but it needs capital, there's been too much spent already, and there is going to be a hit, and so the ratchet negotiation then starts, and the early stage guys are saying no way, and that's the, the founders are saying no way, and then the late stage, that's their pound of flesh. The third category is the strategic, where there's, there may be very unique deal terms, like there may be a standstill, or there may be an option to buy the company, or there may be the strategic piece where the business plan gets leveraged into the next key market where the company doesn't have resources, like China. And so there's either a joint venture piece or some kind of a high economic value license or IP element going cross-border. And so those are the pieces that tend to coalesce. And I think certainly, in addition to all the money from Asia that is continuing to wash into the Bay Area, the strategic interest and the checks they're willing to write for the right companies it's as strong as I've ever seen it, I think.
Cool. Perhaps we should turn to the M&A market, which has its own interesting dynamics. I think just to set the stage a little bit here, it's again been a fascinating period. Last year, just to give you some data, global M&A, just total global M&A value actually declined by about 20% in the aggregate, but at the same time, China's outbound M&A more than doubled to more than $200 billion. So China jumped from being, an important player to being perhaps the largest player in the global M&A market, and about 20% of that total, so $40 billion, was focused on TMT acquisitions. And China also quadrupled the amount of money spent on acquisitions overall in the United States. So huge increase, and there's obviously many macro factors that impacted that, and of course impacting it the other way now. But it's been a fascinating period, and also something unusual. Last year, about 30% of all M&A in the world was cross-border. So we're seeing a true globalization of the M&A market to a degree that we hadn't seen for a while. Focusing perhaps specifically on the China cross-border opportunity, which I think is of interest to the audience here. We've obviously also seen some real changes, and China's been concerned about capital outflows opposed to all these rules, and there's lots of whether it's capital movements or other activities, there's been some significant changes. So maybe we'll start at the other end, Chuck, and just if you can just say, what are you seeing in the deal flow that you work on? How much of a constraint have these changes had? What daylight are you seeing? Any interesting insights or stories?
Well, they've had a huge impact, I think, and probably Exhibit A is Dalian Wanda and Dick Clark, where they escrowed, the reverse termination fee, and they got to the end of the long stop period, and they didn't, for whatever reason, they weren't able to close, and now the seller is suing in Delaware Chancery Court to get the reverse termination fee. So I think it has had a significant impact. That said, many of especially the strategics that we speak with, remain highly confident that either they have the money, already available in U.S. dollars offshore to deploy, or they can work the regulatory process to be able and convince the target board that it's viable, so that they can get to closing with certainty. And so, with that said, I think there's whether it's venture, strategic, any type of investment from China. I was in Beijing and Shanghai before Chinese New Year. The level of interest has never been higher. I mean, geopolitics, they wave it off. They know somebody, a type of leader like Trump, and so it's just another externality for them to factor into their calculus. I think I've heard talk that it may be loosening mid-year. Formally, the policies are in place until the end of September. As everyone knows, it's a sensitive year in China with the National People's Congress meeting, massive changes in leadership, and so that needs to be managed, and we'll have to see. But the outbound investment policy remains in place, and so I think China will continue to support those kinds of investments.
Alexander, are you in the Indonesian environment? Is China a growing factor, or is it really other parties that are more important to you when you think about the landscape, both for your own opportunities and for opportunities you're seeing more generally in the market?
I mean, on the telco space, I don't think there's a lot of interest from the Chinese investors. Like I said, it's the fixed income kind of investors that are typically interested in the telcos. But the Chinese investors, be that strategic or ventures, are still very much interested in Indonesia there. And I don't see any slowdown. The small ones, I think they're just so much under the radar that they're just going to go anyway, right? Recently, Inter Milan, that used to belong to Indonesian, the Chinese bought Inter Milan from one of the Indonesian business owners. So yeah, I don't see any slowdown there. There was just a deal that happened about a month ago, 2 months ago. So, in the digital space, the deals are not big enough that it goes to the billions per investment. So I think it'll still be under radar, or like what Chuck said, they'll find a structure that makes it possible.
So Elise, one of the interesting things that I've seen is, the first group really to get aggressive internationally was, the BAT companies, right? Because they had a lot of global sophistication. They set up, top-tier teams, often local folks here in the U.S. Obviously, sophisticated people like Connie as well, to really help drive their agendas here. More recently, you've seen this kind of publicly traded A-share companies coming out, frankly, often don't have a lot of international experience. There was a thesis around fundamental just PE arbitrage, right? So that sort of brought a whole bunch of new players into the market. I'd be interested to hear how you describe that landscape and how you think it's evolving, of who the players are.
Sure. I think from later last year, the RMB to US dollar outflow has been tightened up, right? So that control has been enforced by the government. So that, which make a huge